Thank you so much for this opportunity. I was hoping for a candid discussion, and we've had that so far. I have to tell you that as a historian, it's very unusual to be the last person on the agenda in terms of the papers and the respondents. It's usually the historian that comes and lays the context for everybody else. So I'm quite pleased about that. And so my approach is going to be addressing Beth's question that she posed to me. She asked, how does Christian missionary history inform us when it comes to the question of the ethics of witness? I'll be doing this by drawing on my historical research of China medical missions as an exemplar of how complicated the question of faith and practice is, and how contentious it has become. Before delving into the topic at hand, however, I want to provide some background as context to help you decide the extent to which you might find my conclusions useful. I believe that historical studies are as much a reflection of the researcher's values and beliefs and assumptions as they are about the facts and the evidence. And what I will be presenting then may say more about me than the missionaries themselves, which is to say, the ideas that I present are informed by my own interests and should be cautiously applied. So as Dean and Professor of Canada's only, or should I say, the only remaining faith-based nursing program, I am highly sensitive to potentially contradictory expectations held by the evangelical Christian constituency and nursing's provincial bodies when it comes to the notion of sharing the gospel in healthcare settings. In the Canadian context, our university, our nursing program is unique on two counts. One, that it is Christian, and the other, that it is private. Essentially, all other university and college nursing programs in the country are public and secular, and funded then in large part by taxpayer dollars. Similarly, nursing practice is predominantly in public hospitals, and therefore payable by and accountable to taxpayers. Thus, for the most part, nursing education programs in Canada, in our program, social conventions actually simplify the response to the question, is it ethical for nurses and other healthcare professionals to share the gospel with their patients? The answer, one that shuts down the related conversation, is simply no, it is not ethical. In Canada, then, to enter into a professional relationship with a patient with the intention of insisting him or her to come to Christ is widely understood as going against societal and professional ideals of not imposing your beliefs upon another. Sharing the gospel in the hope of seeing someone accept Christ as a result could be viewed as a form of cultural imposition at best, and preying on vulnerable persons for personal gain at worst. I tell you this because it's a backdrop against which I conduct historical research on missionary history, mostly studies of Canadian nurses in China. It influences the kind of questions I pursue in attics and archives and in interviews across Canada, the US, and China. In contemporary Canadian society, healthcare falls decidedly within the public sphere, and religion falls decidedly without. And the sharp line that separates church and state also assumes that healthcare professionals' religious beliefs should be kept quiet. It's a private matter. It's a don't ask, don't tell philosophy when it comes to professional practice. So while Christian nurses may, for example, sense that their faith informs their nursing practice in some positive way, that values such as compassion and the desire to alleviate suffering belong as much to Christianity as they do to nursing, rarely do they have opportunity to explore or express a relationship between faith and nursing. So, when I started to research missionary history as a PhD student, I was driven in part by a desire to understand what it meant to pursue nursing as an expression of the Christian faith. And I was surprised to learn just how central Christianity had been at one time to nursing in Canada. So much so that missionary nursing was viewed by high regard by the Canadian public. And so, for a way to understand, at least from the Canadian context, the current silencing of faith in the workplace, I present the history of Christian missions in China not as a radical or a fringe project as it's understood today, but as a reflection of broader Canadian society values that shifted over time. Preaching to patients. This is, in 1913, the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions published a book about the first 25 years of missionary activity in Henan, China. And the celebratory tome was included in that was this photo here of renowned Dr. James Menzies, an ordained minister and a physician, standing in front of a group of Chinese men with a book, presumably a Bible, in hand. The caption of this photo in this book was called Preaching to Patients, and it was undoubtedly meant to inspire and to assure donors back home that the mission was meeting its intended goal of gaining converts through its medical projects. After all, according to the mission board, conversion was the raison d'etre for the relatively expensive medical pursuits, which included the support of physicians, nurses, and eventually hospitals and nursing schools in China. And it's photos like this one that convince contemporary scholars that medical missionaries were disingenuous, that missionaries offered medical treatment not as an altruistic service, but as a way to lure in potential converts. And in most missionary scholarship that I read, missionary medicine is portrayed as little more than a means to an evangelistic end. I became aware of various critiques of medical missions as a young nurse working in remote First Nations communities in Canada, as well as a nurse working in Uganda as part of a medical and surgical relief team. There are parallels between scholarly critique of historical medical missions and contemporary concerns about the role of religion in healthcare provision. In the Canadian context, and I suspect in the American one as well, critiques of historical medical missions are framed as cautionary tales to healthcare professionals today. So for the remainder of this presentation, I will consider Beth's question, how does Christian missionary history inform us in light of criticism that medical missions were characterized by the following? These are the terms that we see over and over again in mission scholarship. Medical missionaries had colonialist aims, substandard care, ethnocentric approaches, disingenuous motives, and a spiritual focus. Let me start with the critique of colonialist aims. So in each of these slides, I'm going to give some samples of the first part of the critique of colonialism, which I think is actually there, but also with a counterpoint of self-determining, in this case, self-determining aims. So it is true that that medical missions were part of the imperial project to expand the empire, to expand the American and British Empire. In particular, in China, it was the expansion of the British Empire that gave opportunity for Canadians to go to China. They went to China, incidentally, 50 years after the Americans. And it was Hudson Taylor who said to Jonathan Goforth that there was really only one province left that hadn't already been a stake wasn't put in, and that was in Henan province. And the watchword for the Canadian missionaries was taken up by what Hudson Taylor said to Jonathan Goforth, and that was to go forward on your knees. It was a very viciously anti-British province. The concern that missionaries also foster dependency when it came to medical missions is another critique, and I think there's truth to that. That the missionaries, American, British, Canadian, built hospitals and set up a system that then was not self-sustaining, and that the local people became dependent on. It's also true, I would say, that the medical missions in China developed unsustainable programs, that the money was coming from donors overseas, and that when the missionaries left on various occasions because of political disruption, and they were expelled for various reasons over the course of the 120 years that they were there, the programs floundered. On the other hand, the idea that the critique that this undermined Chinese self-determination is not actually accurate, because in fact I think it's a colonial idea in itself to assume that the Chinese were not taking advantage of and putting up with some of the missions in order to take advantage of Western medicine. And I think that what speaks to that particularly well, at least in the Chinese context, is that in 1949 all of the remaining missionaries were expelled from China, and the hospitals and the nursing programs and the medical programs that the missionaries planted are still there today. Another critique is that missionaries gave substandard care. I think some of that is true. I think there's also evidence that missionaries gave cutting-edge care. So the critique about substandard care says that the provisions of care in the mission site were at a lower standard than at home. In some cases that was true, and if you think of, for example, that female physicians weren't able to work in Canada and the U.S. in the late 1800s, and because they were considered to be not giving up to standard care, they were allowed to do that same kind of care in China. It was the hospitals that the missionaries first built were considered to be substandard when in the 1920s, when some reports came around checking the hospitals and seeing what kind of care was given. It was substandard in terms of what was available at home. There's some truth to that. On the other hand, in all of the literature, no matter what perspective the literature is written from, it is the missionaries who are credited with establishing modern nursing in China. There was no modern nursing, hospital-based nursing, outside of the missionaries. And it was the missionaries who developed the first modern hospitals. And something that I found particularly interesting is that the first nursing degree program in Canada started in 1919. The first degree program that Canadian missionaries started in China was in 1922. And so there was a period of time where the nursing systems were developing in parallel in China and back home. Another critique is that missionaries provide ethnocentric care, and I think there's some truth to that. I think the counterbalance is that missionaries also develop culturally sensitive approaches to medical care. So the critique around ethnocentrism is that the conversion was the primary agenda. So when I read literature about nursing saying, it's great that nurses developed modern nursing, we're very grateful for that, it's too bad that they had to bring along this imperialism at the same time, that they brought in these, that it was the reason for being was to convert, otherwise it would have been okay. So having conversion as a primary agenda is a critique. And I think that the ethnocentric idea that the missionaries had, particularly the early missionaries, of their own sense of in the case of the Canadians, of having a British cultural and Christian religious superiority, I think that's true. But that is just part of the point, and I think that's part of the early, there was a real change over the years that the missionaries were in China, and so this is the other part to the story, the culturally sensitive approaches that also went hand in hand. The missionaries tended to see conversion as a primary agenda when they first arrived. That changed over time, the longer they were there. The missionaries that were there for 6 months had a very different belief about China and a very different attitude towards China than the ones that were there for 10 years and 20 years and 30 years. An interesting example there is while in Canada and in the U.S., you weren't allowed to, if you were male, you weren't allowed to enter nursing. In China, this picture that I have here is from 1922. This is a graduating class of male nurses. The reason that the Canadians had classes of male nurses is not because they believed that this was a good thing. In fact, they really took up Florence Nightingale's idea that nursing should be a female profession. But they saw that this was it went against cultural norms in China for women to be taking care of men. And so therefore they went against their own cultural beliefs to adapt to the local beliefs and to have male nurses. There's a very interesting difference between the second generation of nurses and the first generation of nurses. The first generation of nurses were evangelists, were Bible women, were primarily there to teach the Bible, and being nurses was secondary. The second generation of nurses, some of whom were born in China to missionary parents and came back to Canada to get their nursing degree and then went back to China, had a very different understanding of China and its culture. And one particularly interesting quote was from a nurse called Clara Preston, who was in China for about 25 years. And she had a critique when she was writing her own biography. She critiqued the earlier nurses. She said nursing in Henan province took a lot longer to get off the ground than, for example, some of the American missions in the bigger centers. And she put the blame squarely on the earlier nurses. So the Clara Preston had very harsh words for the earlier missionaries. She said that nursing in Henan province would have been a lot further along if the early missionary nurses had spent time concentrating on the development of nursing and not so much time on evangelism. And then the third part, these nurses that were born in China and came back as missionaries, they're a unique group called Mish Kids. Missionary kids is what they call themselves. They were brought up in China. They spoke the language. They understood the culture inherently, and they considered themselves fully Chinese and fully Canadian. They had a very different approach to nursing than the earlier generation. There were nurses and doctors who came back as missionary kids. And so to lump the whole group as ethnocentric is actually not accurate. There was an incredible amount of cultural sensitivity that I've been quite impressed with and have tried to learn myself from. The final critique is that there was the final historical critique of medical missions was that there was an overemphasis on spiritual focus. There was an overemphasis on things spiritual rather than temporal. And so I think that that's true. The initial success of the missionaries in the late 1800s, in 1892, when the Canadians had their first convert, that success was measured by souls saved. And indeed, the first converts were patients. It was this old blind Joe, is what the books would call the man who had his cataracts treated surgically by the Canadian physicians who were also ministers, and this is what led them to believe in Christ. So I think that spiritual focus and the reason for the medical missions as part of the whole missionary package was conversion, was bringing people to the idea of Christianity. However, on the other hand, to say that it was only a spiritual focus and not a temporal focus, I think is inaccurate and unbalanced. So these people that I have listed here are particular examples of Margaret Gay, for example, who came out to China as a Bible woman. She saw that there was a small hospital that had been closed because it didn't have enough medical service. They didn't have the personnel. And so she came back to Canada as an older student. She wasn't actually allowed into the program originally because she was too old. I think she was 32. And she came back, and after a year of her listening in on the courses, they allowed her to finish her nursing at Vancouver General Hospital. And then she went back and as a nurse, and felt that she was able to make a bigger difference as a nurse than she could make as an evangelist. 1920s Reverend Andrew Thompson was a minister who ended up after a few years, he said, how can I ignore the needs of the people that Jesus did not ignore the needs of the healthcare needs of the people, and I can't either. And so he saw it very much as part of his evangelical work to build a small hospital. There was the first nursing student. Her surname is Joe. It turns out that she was the nursing students in the very first class that went through the nursing school in Henan province. Joe was the granddaughter of old blind Joe. And so there was this moving over of the first converts were patients, but interestingly, it was their sons and daughters who went into nursing. Disingenuous motives is the idea that conversion was a hidden agenda, and this idea of healing bodies in order to open hearts to Christ is the things that I think critics of missions and critics of faith-based healthcare fear the most. But this is where I think it becomes interesting that, so you'll see that the picture here is a slice of the first picture that I showed, this preaching to patients slide. What I was very interested to see in looking at the documents is there was a real difference in private documents and public documents. What I mean is that what the missionaries were writing in their own letters to friends, to their parents, was quite different than what they were writing for bulletins and things that were going to be absorbed by the public. There was also diversity among individuals. To say that everybody had the agenda of conversion is inaccurate. In fact, in the 1930s, a really important book came out called Rethinking China Missions, which was the missionaries looking at themselves and starting to question whether evangelism should be, if they were questioning in the 1930s whether evangelism was ethical, if that was an ethical thing for missionaries to be doing. And so to lump, it's always difficult to be making these generalizations, but I think the more that I learn about medical missionary work is that it's very much distinguished by individuals and individual people, as well as denominations, as well as the time that they were there. There was a big difference between the missionaries in the 1890s and the ones in the 1940s. So back to this photo of preaching to patients. So I told you that this was from a 1913 tome that was given out to celebrate the first 25 years of missions in China. And when I found this same photo in the archives, you'll see something very different across the bottom. Here it says, Dr. Menzies with his workmen at morning prayers. This is not a photo of Dr. Menzies preaching to patients. This is a photo of Dr. Menzies with his workmen at morning prayers. So that difference between what the donors and what the people back home were expecting missionaries to do and what the missionaries expected of themselves when they first went out to China was very different than what went in on the ground when they were faced with the hordes and the hundreds of thousands of people that desperately needed immediate medical care. And for those who were living there for generations, for upwards of 40, 50, 60 years, is not adequately captured in the critiques that we have and the assumptions that we make about missionaries. So this is my conclusion. How does Christian missionary history inform us? I think it informs us in three ways. I think the first way, and the one that we tend to focus on the most, the one that's most controversial, and the one that we assume we're talking about when we talk about witness, is this one, is witnessing to patients. This is things like reading the Bible and teaching hymns. This is the idea that certainly did generate the earliest medical missionaries, at least to China, that the missionaries were dually educated, that they had MDivs and MDs. They were expected to have both to go out to China. What I noticed, though, and what I just alluded to, was that this idea of witnessing to patients, however, I think was exaggerated as a way to appease the expectations of the church and donors. And for historians looking back on this particular type of witness, of witnessing to patients, this is viewed negatively historically. This is seen as cultural imposition. The second type of witnessing that we don't tend to talk about as much, and yet I would suspect at a place like of Loma Linda, and certainly at my institution, we do a lot of work with students, and this was true in the field of nursing in China. That the students that came to the nursing schools were expected to be Christian. Interesting, when the nursing school opened in 1920, there were Christians, young Christian women and men who, and there were churches that served as pools for the missions, but there wouldn't have been those pools if the missionaries hadn't come 30 years earlier to be doing the evangelizing to create the churches that created the pools. So while Clara Preston was critiquing Margaret Gay at the same time, or critiquing the earlier missionary nurses, at the same time, they wouldn't have had a pool of Christian students if there hadn't have been the evangelists in the first place. But this witnessing to students is this idea that of teaching biblical principles to support the development of compassionate care. Witnessing to students was a conventional aspect of nurses' training at home and abroad. Marcia spoke yesterday about the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing, schools of nursing. These were secular nursing programs, but when I look at the schools of nursing, certainly in Canada, they were religious-based. There was, whether you were Christian or not, if you came there as a student, you had Bible study and you were taught that nursing was a calling, that it was a response to the gospel, that the best nurses were taking up the idea of a religious motivation. And so the idea of witnessing to students was not an unusual idea. In Canada, we say we have 400 years of nursing history. 400 years because it was religious nurses that started. It was the Grey nuns that started nursing in Canada in what's now Quebec, and it spread across. And they were the early missionaries. They spread a certain idea of nursing west across the country. So witnessing to students then, the historians would view this as something that was neutral. It's the idea that nurses, nursing students who come to a faith-based institution then or now make that choice, that it's self-determining in the sense that they know what they're getting into if they're coming to a Christian nursing school. That's the way it's viewed by historians looking back on the early missionary medicine and nursing schools. The final one then is this idea of witnessing to community. I think it was touched on earlier a little bit when we talked about the notion of what does it mean to be a Christian institution, how that's different when an institution is presenting itself to the community as compared to an individual presenting themselves as Christian to an individual. Over time, missionaries in China at least came to perceive their role as primarily medical. This was a controversial idea in the church early on, but over time there was acceptance that the main reason and indeed towards the end of the missionary period, the only good reason to be in China was to be providing medical care. This is the important point to me anyway that I want to be making here, is that when we look at missionary history, the missionaries themselves came to view alleviating suffering as witness. That was the witness. That was enough. Alleviating suffering is Christian witness. And when this comes up in historical literature, this is viewed positively. This aspect of medical missions, of being other-centered and compassionate, is viewed very positively historically. So I'm going to just end on 3 slides to bring this home, this idea home. When I went into missionary history, I did so without having any connection to China. My background is Dutch. I didn't even know there were medical missionaries in China. My background is international nursing myself. I didn't have much interest in history. I stumbled across, as part of my PhD studies, some letters from China that were published in the Canadian Nurse Journal in the 1930s and 40s, and I thought that might make an interesting paper for one of the courses that I took, and instead I photocopied every letter I could find, sat down with them, and discovered there were some really interesting things going on in China that I had never heard of. I didn't realize Canadians were ever there, never mind that they were there for 60 years, never mind that they developed nursing schools and hospitals there. So I sat down to spend the next number of years studying just what happened, who were the nurses, what were they doing there, and why did these letters stop after 1946? There were no more letters. 1947. And what I discovered is that the Canadian nurses, like all the other missionaries, were expelled from China in 1949 when Mao Zedong came into power. And so when I got to have contacts, I started developing contact with the nurses and physicians, or at least their children and grandchildren, who had left China in the 1940s. I found out that they didn't really know what, they hadn't been back for 60 years. They didn't know whether anything that they had done existed. And the missionary children that I spent time with saw their parents' missions as a shameful past, as an M word, as something that something to as a skeleton in their closet that they didn't want to talk about. It turned out that I went to China because I was writing my dissertation on it. I thought I should at least visit the country to get a sense of what China was like. And my husband and I went on a tour, and we did a side trip into Henan province. And we hired a driver and interpreter. We had some photos. We drove around, and lo and behold, we came across a building, the building that you see here, this blue building that I recognized from photos as the hospital that the Canadians built in this city called Huihui, and it was the site of the first Canadian nursing school. I had my husband take a picture of me in front of the doors, and I peered in the windows and thought this was quite cool, and thought that was a good enough reason to have gone to China. And so I came back home, defended my dissertation, and started at the University of Lethbridge about a month later. And it was at a dinner, and I happened to be sitting across from the mayor of Lethbridge. And he said, asked me politely what my dissertation was about, and I told him, and he said, "Oh yeah, China, oh yeah, Henan, I've been there." And I said, "Well, you must mean Henan, because nobody's heard of the way it's spelled in English ways. Nobody's heard of Henan. You must mean Henan." And he said, "No, I was in Anyang." And Anyang, as it turns out, Anyang, my ears perked up, because that was the site that the first Canadian missionaries went to in 1888 was Anyang. That's where they were headed to. And he said, "Yeah, in fact, we have a delegation coming from Anyang in May." This was in January. One of them is a physician, and they would like to talk about some medical and nursing exchanges. Maybe you would be interested. Oh, he said, and the reason for that is because Lethbridge, which is a little tiny town by Medicine Hat in Alberta, is going to become twin cities with Anyang. So I met up with this doctor, Dr. Song, and I found myself back in China a few months later, meeting with starting to set up this missionary nursing exchange. And while I was there, I asked if I could meet the head of the Huihui Hospital, which is a hospital you see here, and I showed him a videotape that I put together of the history that was dubbed into Mandarin, and I was standing in a room much like this one. And I don't understand Chinese, and there was a lot of buzzing going along in the room. And finally someone translated for me, and they said, "Next year is our 110th anniversary, and we don't have any history from before 1947. Can you come back, can you celebrate with us, and can you take some of the Canadian missionary kids with you?" And so I did. And so the picture that you see here in the very center is Dr. Zhang. He is the president of the Huihui Hospital. This is the 110th anniversary, and 4 people in this picture, the 2 women in the front row, and they're the one directly behind them in the black, and then the woman off to the side in the leather jacket. They were all born in China. They hadn't been back in 60 years. And so we did a documentary of their return. The other people in the picture are physicians and nurses that went as part of the medical nursing exchange. These missionaries that came, they were surprised, they were delighted that that they were remembered at all. And so the point that I want to leave you with then is that despite all the controversy, despite the concerns that we have of witness, despite our stumblings and fumblings, and certainly there's lots of stumbling and fumblings that and the anxiety and self-reflection that went on in missions in the past, despite this, the legacy that the missionaries left continues to this day, and what we were most surprised about, most delighted about, is that the missionaries were celebrated in 2006 at the hospital's 110th anniversary. Thank you.